They said Sweden's Gripen was a toy. Then it humiliated the F-35. For years, Sweden's Gripen fighter was dismissed as a lightweight toy, a budget jet built by a small nation with no chance of rivaling America's stealth behemoth, the F-35 Lightning II. Analysts mocked its size, its single engine, its relatively low price tag. Yet when the two aircraft finally clashed in NATO wargames, the outcome stunned everyone. Against the trillion-dollar machine that was supposed to dominate the skies, Sweden's underdog fighter danced, outmaneuvered, and struck with ruthless precision. Pilots in command of the F-35s found themselves outclassed in the very domains they thought were untouchable. What followed was not just a tactical humiliation but a strategic wake-up call, proof that the balance of air power is never set in stone. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Comment below. The skies of modern warfare are littered with legends: the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the F-15 Eagle, the Eurofighter Typhoon, names etched into military history. But in recent decades, one fighter has dominated headlines above all others: the F-35 Lightning II, marketed as the crown jewel of American aerospace innovation. The F-35 program consumed over $1 trillion and spanned decades of development. It promised to revolutionize combat with its stealth profile, sensor fusion, and unmatched network connectivity. Nations invested billions to secure access, while NATO strategists hailed it as the jet that would guarantee air dominance for the 21st century. Against this backdrop, Sweden's Saab 39 Gripen appeared almost laughable to many defense analysts. A lightweight single-engine fighter designed by a neutral nation with a modest defense budget, Gripen was derided as a toy jet, a cheap alternative for countries that couldn't afford real fighters. Its price tag, less than half that of an F-35, reinforced the perception that it was a budget compromise, not a frontline champion. The world saw Sweden as pragmatic but limited, capable of producing competent defensive tools, yet incapable of rivaling the aerospace giants of the United States. And yet, buried in this quiet Scandinavian design philosophy was something more. Sweden had crafted a warplane that reflected its own survival instincts. With a population smaller than many US states and no nuclear arsenal, Sweden could not afford to play by the same rules as NATO's superpowers. Its defense doctrine centered on resilience, adaptability, and speed. Gripen was not designed to overwhelm with raw power. It was designed to frustrate, outlast, and outthink larger adversaries. The contrast with the F-35 could not have been sharper. While the Lightning II relied on vast networks, satellite links, and massive logistical chains, Gripen was built to thrive in isolation. It could refuel and rearm on roads in 20 minutes. It could take off from improvised strips deep in forests. Its pilots trained to fight independently, with onboard electronic warfare systems that could blind enemy sensors and create chaos in the skies. It was not a titan, but a clever survivor, the fox in a world of lions. As NATO expanded its joint exercises in the early 2000s and 2010s, Gripen found itself tested against some of the most advanced aircraft in the alliance, including the much-vaunted F-35. These were not open wars but wargames, simulations designed to test strategy, readiness, and technology. For F-35 squadrons, these drills were an opportunity to showcase why their aircraft justified such a staggering price tag. For Gripen, it was a chance to prove that Sweden's philosophy of fighting smart could hold its own in a world of giants. At first, few took the matchup seriously. NATO pilots joked about Gripen's small frame and limited weapons payload. Some even called it a sports car fighter, fun to fly, agile, but ultimately irrelevant in a real war against stealth giants. The F-35, after all, was the chosen vessel of American dominance, designed not only to win but to reshape the very nature of aerial combat. How could a small Scandinavian design stand against that tide? But history has a way of humbling expectations. Just as the underdog Spartan hoplites once stood against Persia's vast armies, just as nimble British Spitfires once thwarted German bombers over the Channel, the Gripen was about to rewrite assumptions. What looked like a budget fighter was in fact a scalpel, honed by decades of Swedish strategy to cut through overconfidence and complexity. The stakes in these wargames went beyond pride. If the F-35 was shown to be vulnerable, even in simulated engagements, it would raise uncomfortable questions for NATO allies who had invested billions. Conversely, if Gripen proved effective, it would validate Sweden's defense doctrine and elevate its role in European security. This was not just a contest of machines, but of philosophies, brute force and networked dominance against agility and independence. The first encounters would not merely be skirmishes in the sky. They would be symbolic duels, fought on the proving grounds of NATO's exercises, but echoing into boardrooms and defense ministries worldwide. At the heart of it stood a question that had haunted militaries for centuries. When the world invests in giants, can an underdog still deliver humiliation? By the time the first simulated missiles locked on target, the answer would stun everyone watching. The F-35 stood as the most expensive weapon system in history, its dominance presumed beyond question. Gripen was dismissed as a lightweight challenger, mocked as a toy, yet as NATO exercises loomed, Sweden's toy jet was about to expose vulnerabilities in the West's most treasured fighter, and the humiliation would shake the balance of aerial power, developing context and stakes. To understand why Gripen's confrontation with the F-35 carried such weight, we need to step back into Sweden's unique defense philosophy. Unlike the United States or even its European neighbors, Sweden has long prepared for the possibility of standing alone in a crisis. Neutrality was not just political posturing, it was a survival strategy. If a great power attacked, Sweden would have no time to wait for allies. Its armed forces had to be lean, adaptable, and able to sustain operations with minimal outside support. This philosophy shaped every decision in the Gripen's design. Unlike the F-35, which required sprawling airbases and specialized maintenance crews, Gripen was engineered for resilience. In Swedish doctrine, a squadron could disperse to roads and highways across the countryside, hiding in forests, rearming in minutes, and vanishing before enemy satellites could track them. Ground crews of just 6 conscripts could reload and refuel the jet in under 20 minutes. Every feature reflected a cold, practical calculation in a real war. Survival depended on speed, simplicity, and mobility. The F-35 represented the opposite pole of design thinking. It was the culmination of America's vision of full-spectrum dominance, a stealth aircraft that lived within a web of satellites, data links, and advanced radar systems. Its stealth coatings, supercomputing power, and sensor fusion meant that a pilot could see the battlefield with unmatched clarity. But with this came dependency. For NATO, the stakes of testing these jets against one another went far beyond simple competition. Billions of dollars in defense budgets were riding on the promise of the F-35. Member states were phasing out older fighters to replace them with the Lightning II, reshaping entire air forces around its capabilities. If a smaller, cheaper aircraft could consistently challenge it in exercises, what would that say about the alliance's strategic direction? Was NATO betting too heavily on one jet, one philosophy, one expensive promise? For Sweden, the stakes were more personal. Gripen was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of sovereignty. Sweden could not afford massive fleets of heavy stealth bombers or carriers. Instead, it invested in Gripen as its frontline deterrent, a machine designed to protect its skies against larger powers like Russia. Proving that Gripen could hold its own against the F-35 was not just a matter of prestige. It was validation that Sweden's independence, its doctrine, and its survival instincts had merit on the modern battlefield. The upcoming NATO war games would therefore be more than an exercise. They would be a clash of two visions of airpower. On one side, a trillion-dollar program built on stealth, networks, and technological dominance. On the other, a comparatively modest design, built on agility, electronic warfare, and independence. The results would ripple far beyond the pilots in their cockpits. Observers from across Europe, from defense ministries to think tanks, waited to see whether Gripen's philosophy could withstand the crushing expectations set by America's crown jewel. Crushing expectations set by America's crown jewel. For the F-35 pilots, the exercise seemed almost routine. Their jet was marketed as nearly invincible in simulated combat, its stealth making detection almost impossible. Many entered the war games with supreme confidence. For the Gripen pilots, however, this was no ordinary drill. This was a chance to prove their aircraft's worth not only to NATO, but to the world. They carried the weight of a nation that had been dismissed, underestimated, and even ridiculed in defense circles. When the first sorties launched, both sides knew what was at stake, but only one side understood how quickly overconfidence can turn into humiliation. Sweden's doctrine emphasized agility, independence, and survival. While the F-35 represented networked dominance at staggering cost, NATO was betting its future on one philosophy. Sweden was betting its sovereignty on another. The stage was set for a clash that would challenge everything the alliance thought it knew about airpower, intensifying conflict or threat, build tension. NATO exercises bring Gripen into simulated combat with F-35s. F-35 pilots enter confident, almost dismissive. Gripen pilots prepare with asymmetric tactics designed to exploit weaknesses. Tactical and technical breakdown. Detail the first encounters, Gripen's data link superiority, radar spoofing, electronic warfare, and ability to operate with lightning-fast turnaround on dispersed bases. Compare with F-35's stealth advantages. But vulnerabilities in dogfighting and over-reliance on network stability, mini-resolution or tactical pause, show how initial Gripen victories shock NATO observers. Some dismiss them as flukes, others recognize tactical brilliance. The pause sets up the larger wave of simulated clashes. What tactical decision surprised you most so far? Share your thoughts in the comments. Escalation and second wave of action. Describe the escalation. Larger-scale simulated engagements where Gripen continues to outmaneuver the F-35 highlight pilot accounts. Psychological stress inside F-35 cockpits, and Sweden's cold precision, approaching the climax strike, build to the decisive exercise. NATO sets up a large multi-aircraft battle. Gripen squadrons execute ambush tactics, use jamming, and exploit low-cost agility to kill F-35s. Show the human drama of F-35 pilots realizing they're trapped. True resolution and immediate aftermath reveal the outcome. Gripen decisively embarrasses F-35 units in multiple rounds, show NATO observers stunned, discussions about doctrine shifting, and quiet acknowledgement that Sweden had changed the narrative. Strategic reflection and closing thoughts. When the NATO exercises concluded, the shockwaves reverberated across the alliance. Sweden's Gripen had not merely scored simulated victories, it had shattered the assumption that the F-35 stood unchallenged as the pinnacle of modern air power. For years, the Lightning II was touted as untouchable, the stealth spearhead of a trillion-dollar program. Yet here it was, humbled by a single-engine fighter from a small Scandinavian nation that many had mocked as a toy. The lesson was both simple and unsettling. Cost is not a guarantee of combat dominance. The F-35's strength lay in its stealth, sensors, and integration into a vast network. But those strengths also revealed vulnerabilities. When connectivity faltered or jamming took effect, the aircraft's advantage diminished. Gripen, by contrast, was designed for exactly those environments. It thrived on improvisation, dispersed operations, rapid turnaround, and on-board electronic warfare systems that turned simplicity into survivability. For NATO, this clash of doctrines raised hard questions. Should air forces double down on complex, expensive jets that require sprawling infrastructure? Or should they invest in fighters like Gripen, cheaper to operate yet capable of punching above their weight? Was the future of air power about a few cutting-edge machines or fleets of adaptable aircraft able to fight under the harshest conditions? The psychological impact was just as significant. For F-35 pilots accustomed to overwhelming simulations, being killed by Gripen was a jarring experience. It forced them to think not only about their aircraft's strengths but also about their own over-reliance on technology. Gripen pilots, on the other hand, gained quiet validation. They had proven that skill, adaptability, and doctrine could level the field, even against America's most advanced jet. For Sweden, the reflections were both proud and cautious. Gripen's victories validated its doctrine of survival through agility. But Swedish commanders knew no fighter was invincible. The triumph reinforced their humility. Prepare for the worst, adapt relentlessly, never assume superiority. That very mindset was what had allowed Gripen to thrive against odds. For the United States and its allies, the results were harder to digest. The F-35 program could not simply be abandoned. It was too embedded in global defense networks and too politically invested. But the exercises highlighted a critical truth. No single system, however advanced, could dominate in isolation. Future doctrine would need balance, stealth jets for penetration, but also resilient aircraft like Gripen to absorb shocks and operate independently. The symbolism of the clash was undeniable. It became a modern parable of David versus Goliath, proof that small nations, through ingenuity and discipline, could humble giants. This narrative spread far beyond NATO circles, inspiring other countries seeking cost-effective fighters. Gripen was no longer just an affordable option. It was a proven philosophy, one that suggested agility and adaptability might matter more than raw complexity in tomorrow's wars. Ultimately, Gripen's triumph was less about humiliating the F-35 and more about exposing a deeper truth. Arrogance and over-reliance on technology can be fatal. War rarely unfolds under perfect conditions. The side that survives is not the one with the most expensive machines, but the one most prepared for chaos. Sweden's Gripen embodied that lesson, and its victories forced even the mightiest air forces to reconsider what true dominance means. The F-35's aura of invincibility faded in the face of Gripen's adaptability. NATO saw that survival depends less on spending than on resilience. The underdog had humbled the giant, and in doing so, rewrote the future of air power doctrine. The NATO exercises ended, but their consequences rippled far beyond the training grounds. What had begun as a routine test of readiness evolved into a lesson with global implications. Sweden's Gripen had not just embarrassed the F-35 in simulated combat, it had forced the alliance and the wider world to confront the uncomfortable truth that technology alone does not guarantee dominance. The Gripen was never meant to be a rival to America's trillion-dollar flagship. It was designed to keep Sweden alive in the shadow of larger powers, to be cheap enough to produce in numbers, simple enough to operate from highways, and cunning enough to survive without the safety net of a massive alliance. But by outperforming the F-35 in the most unexpected ways, Gripen transformed from a national defender into a global symbol, proof that the underdog can still unsettle giants. Sweden's Vindication. For Sweden, the exercises were a vindication decades in the making. Its defense establishment had long been mocked for building fighters on a budget, for pursuing independence when most European nations tethered themselves to American technology. Critics dismissed Gripen as a compromise aircraft, good for nations that could not afford better. Yet the war games proved otherwise. Gripen's victories validated Sweden's survivalist philosophy: never assume perfect conditions, never depend on others, and always prepare to fight alone. In a world where larger nations built fighters around sprawling logistics and global networks, Sweden had bet on adaptability, and that bet paid off. For the Swedish public, It was more than military pride. It was national affirmation, proof that a small country could still shape the global conversation about war. Gripen was no longer a toy jet. It was a fox among lions, and the world now recognized its bite. NATO's quiet recalibration. For NATO, the humiliation cut deeper. The F-35 program could not simply be abandoned. Too much money, time, and political capital had already been invested. But Gripen's success forced a quiet recalibration. The alliance began to admit, at least in classified discussions, that reliance on a single fighter type was dangerous. The F-35 remained the stealth spearhead, designed for first-day-of-war penetration and advanced strike missions. But the exercises revealed its limits. Without reliable networks, without AWACS guidance, and under heavy jamming, its advantages shrank. Gripen had thrived precisely because it did not need perfect conditions. NATO planners began to recognize the value of complementary fleets, a mix of high-end, stealth and rugged, adaptable fighters capable of surviving disruption. In the end, Gripen did not dethrone the F-35, but it forced the alliance to see air power not as a one-jet solution but as an ecosystem, where resilience mattered as much as technological superiority. The human lessons. Beyond the machines, the war games also shaped the pilots. For F-35 aviators, used to simulations in which they dominated effortlessly, being shot down by Gripens was a jarring experience. Many admitted privately that the drills forced them to confront their over-reliance on technology. Flying the Lightning II had conditioned them to trust the computer more than their instincts. Against Gripen, they rediscovered the raw pressure of close-in combat. Gripen pilots, on the other hand, walked away with quiet confidence. They knew they had entered the exercises as underdogs. Every kill was more than a tactical success. It was validation of years of training built around improvisation and independence. For them, the lesson was not arrogance, but affirmation. Skill, discipline, and doctrine still mattered in an age obsessed with high-tech solutions. Broader reflections on air power. History has long shown that overcomplexity is brittle. German Tiger tanks were formidable but too few, too heavy, and too maintenance-hungry to hold back swarms of Soviet T-34s. In Vietnam, nimble MiGs embarrassed more advanced American aircraft by fighting on their own terms. The Gripen's triumph over the F-35 belonged to that same lineage. It was not that Gripen was better in every sense. It lacked the F-35's stealth profile, its deep strike capability, and its global support ecosystem. But Gripen excelled where it mattered most, fighting through imperfection. It could disperse, rearm on highways, spoof enemy sensors, and operate with minimal logistics. In a world where future wars will involve cyber attacks, jamming, and degraded communications, this philosophy looked less like second-rate design and more like foresight. The lesson was stark. Resilience beats perfection. Toward the future. Looking forward, Gripen's story continues to shape doctrine. The Gripen E, Sweden's latest variant, carries a stronger engine, more advanced radar, extended range, and electronic warfare systems rivaling those of larger fighters. It embodies Sweden's ongoing commitment to adaptability, while retaining the ability to refuel and rearm in minutes from improvised bases. Meanwhile, the F-35 continues to evolve. Upgrades to sensors, computing, and weapons integration aim to close the gaps revealed in exercises. Its vast numbers ensure it will remain the backbone of NATO air power for decades. But the aura of untouchability is gone. The Lightning II is still formidable, but no longer seen as invincible. This rivalry is not static. It is a living contest, shaping the balance of air power in real time. Both fighters are evolving, and both philosophies, networked dominance versus independent resilience, will coexist on tomorrow's battlefields. The legacy of the underdog. What, then, is Gripen's true legacy? It is more than an aircraft. It is a reminder that the shape of war is never fixed, that ingenuity can overturn assumptions, and that arrogance is the quickest path to defeat. Gripen proved that even in the age of stealth and trillion-dollar programs, smaller nations can still build weapons that matter. For Sweden, the lesson is pride tempered with humility. Today's victories are tomorrow's challenges. For NATO, it is a call to balance. Never bet everything on one machine, one philosophy, or one budget line. For the world, it is a beacon, proof that resilience and adaptability remain the true currencies of survival. In the end, the war games that humiliated the F-35 will be remembered not just as an embarrassment, but as a turning point. They forced the world to see air combat not through the lens of price tags, but through the realities of resilience. Gripen's story is not about Sweden alone. It is about the eternal lesson of warfare. The underdog, if prepared and cunning, can still humble the giant. And that truth, carried on the wings of Sweden's toy jet, will shape the skies for decades to come. The F-35 remains a titan, but Gripen proved that even titans can stumble. Sweden's underdog fighter rewrote the rules, reminding the world that in the skies of the future, it is not arrogance or wealth that ensures victory, but adaptability, resilience, and the will to survive.